Margaret's hand found mine in the fading evening light, her grip considerably stronger than I expected from a woman who could no longer remember what year it was. "Where's my son?" she asked, the same question she asked almost every evening by that point, though something in her voice that particular night carried a clarity I hadn't heard from her in weeks. "He had a late meeting, Margaret." I told her gently, the same practiced answer I'd given more times than I could count over the past 2 years. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes, considerably sharper than the rest of her fractured mind seemed to allow most days. "You always say that," she said. "But you're always the one here. Every single night it's you." I want you to understand something about that exact moment, because it mattered enormously to everything that happened afterward. I had never once told Margaret about Bradley's affair. I'd made a deliberate choice, from the very beginning, to protect her from that particular pain, believing she deserved whatever peace her remaining months could still offer her, regardless of what her own son was doing while I sat beside her bed every single night. I had no idea, in that quiet bedroom at dusk, that Margaret had already figured out considerably more than I'd ever told her, or exactly what she'd already decided to do about it. My name is Diane Foster, and I'd spent 2 years as my mother-in-law's full-time caregiver while she moved through the specific, devastating fog of advanced Alzheimer's, watching her forget pieces of herself a little more each month while my husband, Bradley, grew increasingly absent from both our marriage and his own mother's final years. Before I tell you what Margaret actually did in the weeks before she passed, because the phone call I received from her attorney 4 days after her funeral changed absolutely everything about how this story ends. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, this story does not end the way either Bradley or I expected it to. Margaret squeezed my hand once more that evening, harder than her illness should have allowed. "You're a good woman, Diane," she said, her voice suddenly and briefly entirely clear, the way it sometimes was in those rare, precious lucid moments her disease still occasionally permitted her. "Don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise." I had no idea, sitting beside her that evening, exactly how much weight that single sentence was about to carry, or exactly how completely Margaret's quiet, clear-eyed observation of the past 2 years was about to reshape both my future and Bradley's, in a way neither of us could have anticipated. I want to take you back to the beginning, because understanding exactly what those 2 years actually required of me matters enormously to understanding everything that happened afterward. Margaret's diagnosis came just over 2 years before that evening in her bedroom, the specific, devastating clarity of an Alzheimer's diagnosis arriving during what should have been an ordinary retirement for a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching elementary school, with a warmth I'd admired from the very first time Bradley introduced us. I want to be honest about the decision Bradley and I made together, early on, to become Margaret's primary caregivers rather than placing her in a facility. A decision I supported fully, genuinely wanting to give her the dignity of remaining in familiar surroundings for as long as possible. I gave up my part-time bookkeeping work within the first 6 months, once Margaret's needs had progressed beyond what any part-time arrangement could reasonably accommodate. I want to walk you through what those 2 years actually looked like day to day, because I think caregiver is a word that doesn't fully capture its physical and emotional weight. It looked like relearning, patiently, every single morning, who I was to a woman who sometimes recognized me instantly, and other times looked at me like a stranger who'd wandered into her home. It looked like managing medication schedules with obsessive precision, redirecting confusion and occasional fear with a calm I didn't always genuinely feel, bathing and dressing a woman who'd once been fiercely, proudly independent. It looked, too, at the entirely unglamorous physical exhaustion of disrupted sleep, Margaret's confusion often worsening in the specific hours after dusk that caregivers call sundowning, requiring exactly the kind of patient, middle-of-the-night presence I provided, night after night, for 2 straight years. I want to walk you through the specific timeline of Bradley's absence, because it mattered enormously to understanding exactly how much of this caregiving burden fell entirely on me alone. For the first 6 months following his mother's diagnosis, Bradley remained genuinely present, taking his own shifts sitting with her, researching treatment options, present for the difficult early conversations about long-term care. Around the 8-month mark, his presence began thinning noticeably. Business trips grew more frequent. Evenings out with clients extended later. Weekends that had once been reliably devoted to giving me a few hours of respite began disappearing into vague, unexplained obligations. I want to be honest that I noticed this shift immediately, though I initially attributed it to the specific, understandable difficulty many adult children face watching a parent's cognitive decline. A kind of avoidant grief I'd read about and tried, generously, to give him space to process in his own way. I met Corinne Ashford exactly once, at a charity gala roughly 14 months into Margaret's illness, introduced to me by Bradley simply as a friend from the investment group. I want to be honest that something about the specific familiarity between them registered immediately, even before I had any concrete reason to suspect an affair. The particular ease of their conversation, the way Bradley's entire posture shifted, lighter and more animated, in a manner I hadn't seen directed toward me in longer than I wanted to admit. I confronted him gently about it that same night, in the car on the drive home. "She's just a business connection," he said, his voice carrying a specific, practiced smoothness I would later recognize as rehearsed rather than genuine reassurance. I want to be honest that I let myself believe him, mostly, for several more months, exhausted by caregiving in a way that left very little emotional bandwidth to investigate a suspicion I desperately hoped wasn't true. I found undeniable confirmation roughly 4 months before that evening in Margaret's bedroom. A hotel receipt in Bradley's jacket pocket, dated on an evening he'd told me was a work dinner, alongside a series of text messages I glimpsed accidentally on his phone screen. Warm and unmistakably intimate in a way that left no real room for alternate explanation. I confronted him directly that time, and I want to be honest about his response, because it revealed something considerably uglier than simple infidelity. "I can't do this anymore, Diane," he said. "Watching my mother disappear a little more every day. You buried in caregiving constantly. Corinne is just easier. She doesn't need anything from me. She's not sick, she's not stressed, she's just easy." I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to sit with it, because it mattered enormously to understanding exactly what kind of man I'd been married to for the past 11 years. He'd chosen a wealthy socialite over his own dying mother's final months, specifically because caring for either of us had become inconvenient to him. I had no idea, absorbing that devastating admission, exactly how much Margaret herself, in the fog of her own declining mind, had already begun quietly noticing about her son's absence, or exactly what she was already planning to do about it, entirely on her own, without a single word from me. I want to walk you through exactly how I eventually learned the scope of what Margaret had actually understood during those final months, because it happened gradually, pieced together only after her death through conversations with her longtime attorney, and eventually, her own private journal, which I discovered while sorting through her belongings. Advanced Alzheimer's, I want to explain for anyone unfamiliar with its specific progression, doesn't move in a single, steady decline. It moves in waves. Periods of significant confusion punctuated, unpredictably, by moments of startling clarity that can last minutes or occasionally, considerably longer. I'd witnessed dozens of these lucid windows over 2 years, moments where Margaret would suddenly reference something with perfect, sharp accuracy before the fog returned minutes later. I've since learned, through her journal, that Margaret used several of these lucid windows specifically to observe and record her own son's behavior, understanding, with a clarity that devastated me once I finally read her words, considerably more than either Bradley or I ever gave her credit for. One entry, dated roughly 5 months before her death, read simply, "Bradley hasn't visited in 11 days. Diane hasn't left my side once. I am not as far gone as everyone assumes." I want to walk you through a later entry that revealed exactly how much she'd pieced together, entirely on her own, about Bradley's affair. Dated roughly 10 weeks before her death. "Bradley smells like a perfume that isn't Diane's. He came to see me today for the first time in 3 weeks, distracted the entire visit, checking his phone repeatedly. I am old and forgetful, not blind. I raised that boy better than this, whatever is happening." I want to be honest about the specific grief I felt reading those words for the first time, understanding that Margaret had spent her final lucid months quietly absorbing a betrayal I'd worked so hard to shield her from, entirely through her own careful observation, rather than anything I'd ever confirmed to her directly. Margaret's attorney, a longtime family friend named Harold Whitfield, later told me that Margaret had contacted his office directly, during one of her clearer stretches roughly 6 weeks before her death, requesting a private meeting away from both Bradley and myself. She was completely lucid during that meeting, Harold told me afterward. Sharper, honestly, than some clients half her age. She told me she wanted her will updated, and she was very specific and deliberate about exactly why. I want to walk you through what Harold told me Margaret actually said during that meeting, because her own words mattered enormously to understanding the full weight of her decision. My son abandoned both his dying mother and his devoted wife for a woman who offers him nothing but convenience, she reportedly told Harold. Diane gave up 2 years of her own life, her own career, her own comfort, to make sure I wasn't alone. I want to make absolutely certain she isn't left with nothing once I'm gone, regardless of what my son believes he's still entitled to. I want to be honest that I had absolutely no idea, during those final 6 weeks, that any of this was happening. Margaret continued her ordinary rhythm of confusion and occasional clarity, and I continued the same devoted daily care I'd provided for 2 years, entirely unaware that she'd already quietly, deliberately restructured her entire estate based on what her own careful observation had shown her. I had no idea, sitting beside her during what would become her final weeks, exactly how completely Margaret's decision was about to upend Bradley's assumptions about his own inheritance, or exactly how much clarity a woman with advanced Alzheimer's had actually maintained about the 2 people caring for her. Right up until the very end. Margaret passed peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning, roughly 6 weeks after that meeting with Harold I knew nothing about, 2 years and 3 months after her diagnosis. I want to be honest about the specific grief of that morning. Genuine and considerable despite everything else happening in my marriage, having spent 2 years building a real, tender relationship with a woman who'd become, in many ways, more present in my daily life than my own husband had been. I want to walk you through Bradley's reaction to his mother's death, because it revealed, once again, the specific gap between his own grief and the actual devotion I'd provided throughout her illness. He was genuinely upset. I want to be fair in acknowledging that. Tears at the funeral that seemed authentic rather than performed. But I noticed, too, Corinne's presence at the reception afterward, standing slightly apart from the immediate family, but present nonetheless, a detail several of Margaret's oldest friends noticed and quietly commented on to me directly. I want to be honest that I said nothing to Bradley about Corinne's presence that day, exhausted by grief and unwilling to create additional conflict during a funeral for a woman I'd genuinely come to love. Harold scheduled the formal will reading 4 days after the funeral, a meeting I attended alongside Bradley in Harold's modest, wood-paneled office, expecting, honestly, a fairly standard division of Margaret's estate between her only son and, perhaps, some acknowledgement of my caregiving contribution. Harold opened the folder and began reading in his measured, professional voice. I, Margaret Foster, being of sound mind during the drafting of this document, wish to leave the entirety of my estate, my home, my savings and all remaining assets, to my daughter-in-law, Diane Foster. I want to walk you through Bradley's reaction in that exact moment, because it mattered enormously to understanding exactly how blindsided he genuinely was. That can't be right, he said, his voice tightening immediately. She wasn't well. She had Alzheimer's, Harold. This has to be some kind of mistake, or undue influence, or... I conducted a full cognitive assessment with her physician present on the day she requested this change, Harold said calmly, sliding a signed medical evaluation across the desk. Your mother was fully lucid and legally competent at the time this will was drafted. I made certain of that specifically, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. Harold continued reading, and I want to walk you through the specific message Margaret had included, because hearing her own words in that moment undid me considerably more than the inheritance itself. To my son Bradley, I love you and I always will. But I spent my final years watching my daughter-in-law give up everything to care for me, while you found comfort elsewhere rather than face what was actually happening to your own mother. I am leaving my estate to Diane not to punish you, but because she is the one who actually earned it, one difficult day at a time, while you were somewhere else entirely. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing those words, sitting in that office, watching Bradley's face drain of color as his mother's own final, deliberate assessment of his choices became permanently, legally undeniable. I had no idea, walking into that meeting, exactly how completely Margaret's own quiet clarity was about to reshape the rest of my life, or exactly how devastatingly her final words were about to confirm everything Bradley had spent 2 years assuming his mother would never actually understand. Bradley and I didn't speak on the drive home from Harold's office, the specific, heavy silence of two people processing an entirely different set of emotions about the exact same revelation. I want to walk you through what happened over the following weeks, because Bradley did initially attempt to contest the will, hiring his own attorney to explore whether Margaret's Alzheimer's diagnosis provided any legitimate grounds to challenge her competency at the time of the change. I want to be honest that this attempt collapsed relatively quickly, given Harold's characteristically thorough documentation, the cognitive assessment, the physician's signature, a video recording Harold had made of the entire meeting specifically anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. Bradley's attorney advised him, within 2 weeks, that pursuing the contest further would likely cost considerably more in legal fees than any realistic chance of success justified. I want to walk you through the conversation Bradley and I finally had, roughly 3 weeks after the will reading, once the initial shock had settled into something more like genuine reckoning. "Why didn't you tell me she knew about Corinne?" he asked me, sitting across from me at our kitchen table. "Because I didn't know she knew," I said honestly. "I never told her anything, Bradley. I protected her from that specifically, because I didn't want her final months clouded with that kind of pain. She figured it out entirely on her own, through her own observation, during moments of clarity you apparently assumed she wasn't capable of anymore." I want to be honest about what I saw cross his face in that moment. Not simple anger at losing an inheritance, but something closer to genuine, devastating grief, understanding that his own mother had spent her final lucid months quietly, painfully aware of exactly how he'd failed both of us. I filed for divorce 6 weeks after the will reading, a decision that felt, by that point, considerably less dramatic than it might have seemed months earlier. Simply the natural, overdue conclusion of a marriage that had already ended in every meaningful sense well before Margaret's death made it undeniable. Bradley didn't contest the divorce with any real intensity, understanding, I think, that whatever case he might have made had already been thoroughly undermined by his own mother's final, clear-eyed assessment of his character. I had no idea, filing that paperwork, exactly how much lighter I would feel once the entire process concluded. Nor did I know exactly how Margaret's final gift was about to reshape not just my financial security, but my entire understanding of what genuine devotion, witnessed clearly even by a mind fighting its own decline, could actually mean. It's been 14 months now since Margaret's passing, and I want to give you an honest account of where things actually stand, rather than a tidier resolution than real grief and rebuilding usually offer. I want to be honest that accepting Margaret's inheritance required its own complicated emotional reckoning, understanding that the comfort it provided came directly from losing a woman I'd genuinely grown to love during those 2 years of caregiving. I used a portion of it to establish a modest scholarship fund in Margaret's name at the elementary school where she'd taught for 30 years, specifically supporting students whose families face financial hardship. A gesture that felt, to me, like the most fitting use of a gift born from her own fierce, clear-eyed love. I kept her house, the same home where I'd spent 2 years caring for her, finding an unexpected comfort in its familiar rooms rather than the grief I initially worried I might feel living there alone. Bradley's relationship with Corinne, I understand through mutual acquaintances, didn't survive the year following Margaret's death, worn down, from what I've heard, by the specific financial strain of a lifestyle Bradley could no longer fully sustain without his expected inheritance, alongside whatever genuine difficulty remained in building something real on a foundation that had begun with this much betrayal already embedded in it. I don't feel particular satisfaction hearing that. I've found mostly a quiet indifference toward the details of Bradley's life now, the specific, settled peace of someone who has genuinely closed a difficult chapter rather than simply moved past it in appearance alone. I've thought often, over these past 14 months, about the specific, remarkable clarity Margaret maintained even as her own mind fought against her daily. I think there's something genuinely profound in understanding that a woman losing pieces of her own memory, her own sense of time and place, could still see, with startling precision, exactly who actually loved her and exactly who had chosen convenience over devotion. I don't think Margaret's final decision was about punishing her son, not really, despite how devastating it clearly was for him to receive nothing. I think it was about something simpler and considerably more powerful. A dying woman making absolutely certain that genuine devotion, even devotion that went largely unacknowledged and unrewarded for 2 exhausting years, was finally, undeniably seen. If you've ever poured yourself into caring for someone while the people who should have shared that burden chose easier, more convenient paths instead, I want you to hear this clearly. The people you care for, even in their most vulnerable, diminished states, often understand considerably more than anyone gives them credit for. Devotion doesn't require constant acknowledgement to be genuinely seen. Sometimes the person you're caring for most faithfully is quietly, carefully watching everyone around them with a clarity that outlasts even their own failing memory. And sometimes, when it matters most, they find a way to make sure that clarity speaks for itself. Bradley chose a wealthy, convenient distraction over both his marriage and his own dying mother's final years, certain that his mother's declining mind would never fully register what he'd done. He had no idea, sitting in that attorney's office listening to his mother's own final words, exactly how clearly she'd actually seen him, or exactly how completely her quiet, deliberate final decision was about to confirm everything he'd spent 2 years assuming he'd successfully hidden.